Welcome to Wing Academy Radio, an extension of Wing Academy of Unfoldment. I'm Diane Wing, your host and guide as we talk about how to evolve using a variety of techniques, concepts, and philosophies. We'll address issues related to the mind, body, and spirit, discover how to release what holds us back, and ways to come into our power. All shows are on demand, so you can listen when it's convenient for you at dianewing.com/radio. Today, my special guest is Jack Adam Weber. He's a traditional Chinese medicine physician, poet, environmental activist, and yoga and Qigong instructor. He's the creator of the Nourish practice, an earth-based rejuvenation, meditation, and Qigong practice. Find out more at jackadamweber.com. Today, we're discussing Jack's book, Climate Cure, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet, where he proposes that the root of our climate crisis comes from a breakdown of the interrelationships between ourselves, the natural world, and our community, and shares techniques to restore these interconnections. Welcome, Jack.
Hi, Diane.
I'm so happy you're here because climate change is a topic near and dear to my heart. And in reading your book, you talk about inner activism and how it impacts climate change. So many people are used to that outer type of activism. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I'm glad that you pulled inner activism out of the book to discuss it. Prior to our getting together here, one line from the book that I highlighted, I didn't tell you I did that, but you've just invoked it and I want to read it. Yeah, it's in the introduction on page 5. And the line is, please consider that 75% of the battle to be climate aware and to take meaningful climate action occurs between our deep hearts and our first steps in the world. So once again, please consider that 75% of the battle to be climate aware and to take meaningful climate action occurs between our deep hearts and our first steps in the world. And what I mean by that is from observing humans, observing myself, working with patients, I've always asking the question, what prevents us from being fully engaged in the world and fully present and fully in our power? And I believe that a lot of our emotions really hold us back from being whole, and they stymie us and they affect our beliefs in non-optimal ways, so that our actions are partial and our actions are not regenerative in the world. So this 75% figure that I threw out is just sort of a nominal estimate. And it means that the integrity of our inner lives affects the integrity of the world that we affect so strongly. So human beings arguably affect the world more than any other species on the planet, especially in deleterious ways. So inner activism is the process of doing our inner work so that we can take the wholeness that we achieve and galvanize and create that outwardly, instead of creating a fractioned world that's hell-bent on a death wish. We can invoke regeneration. And this notion of regeneration in Climate Cure, I juxtaposed and used as metaphor the yin-yang cycle, which is a perennial symbol of regeneration and transformation from dark to light, from light to dark, from dark to light, that endless cycle that we witness most simply in nightfall into daylight. But that process of death and rebirth really happens inside of ourselves. And I go through a deep elaboration in Climate Cure about how to do this work in a really practical way so that we can leverage our difficult emotions so for good. So instead of being held back and stymied by difficulty and pain, we actually leverage it to generate more care and compassion and meaningful action in the world. And that's inner activism in a nutshell.
Okay. So we go and we interact with nature and we take things out on nature. We feel entitled when we're in nature. We claim it. And so we're not really doing the inner work that can be mutually healing for both nature and for us. If we're doing the inner work, right, that can rejuvenate not only ourselves, but the environment around us.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important, isn't it? I mean, I went to, is it Muir Woods in California? And there were busloads of people getting off in these amazing, beautiful woods. And the animals felt lethargic. And the people getting off the bus were just, it felt like they were attacking the forest because they were overwhelming it. The deer were just kind of sitting there like, oh my God, here comes another busload. And the roots of the trees on the paths were shiny from people walking over them. And I just got this sense of sadness for this forest and the way that the people were treating it. And I knew the energy of the people that were going there had not done their inner work. Can you relate to that in the context of interactivism?
I can. Let me just pause with that a sec, because I have to connect some dots and see if they do connect. Let me just start with, instead of the interactivism part there, I'll begin with one of the concepts I present in Climate Cure is our triangle of resilience relationships. And you mentioned that in your little introduction to our interview here. The triangle of resilience relationship is the triangle is composed of three facets: our relationship with ourselves, relationship with one another, and our relationship with the natural world. And so modern humans, especially in first world countries, are largely divorced from a sense of reverence with the natural world, right? And because our culture is driven on media and soap operas and reality TV, people go to nature and think that it's just like another TV show or something, right? Or like going to Disneyland or something foreign to them, right? Instead of something that they're integrally part of, and instead of a sense of awe and reverence and quiet and worship, it's like, oh, how many selfies can we take? And so they place their media apparatuses in between them and this sacred domain of nature. So I think that that's largely a cultural deficit that we're dealing with. And so that's why I devote 2 chapters in the book to our relationship with the natural world. And I use a lot of the metaphors of Chinese medicine, which metaphors show that the outer world is really our inner world, and our inner world is the outer world. And the beauty of that is that we see ourselves as one instead of separate. So what you're describing is the separateness, right? How we're removed from that primal matrix of the natural world and all the psychospiritual benefits and epiphanies that we have in the midst, and we approach it in a modern, disenfranchised, fractioned way. And in the book, I offer a lot of practices and meditations for how to reestablish this sort of sacred bond with the natural world, and especially via recognizing the natural world in ourselves so that we don't see it as so foreign and we have a sense of reverence and sacredness.
Yes. And you also talk about that climate crisis not being separate from ourselves. It's an extension of our collective imbalance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I mean, I agree. I agree with that, and that extremes like affect energy in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're not balanced, how can we expect the environment to be?
Yeah. And at the same time, the publisher chose the title Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. But what I mentioned in the introduction, or chapter 1, is that the reciprocal is also true, that when we heal the world, we heal ourselves, right? The healthier our world is. So sometimes it's a matter of just doing the right thing, even if we don't feel that sense of care. You just do the right thing, and then you reap a benefit from it. So it's a reciprocity. And what I also discuss, a sort of salient overarching notion in the book, is that the climate crisis is our own darkness coming back upon us. So you and I have discussed, and you were sharing with me earlier on in our discussion about how we get little wake-up calls, right? We get little wake-up calls from the proverbial universe. And if we don't pay attention to them, then we get, knocked in the head by a boulder. And so as a healer and in my medicine practice, I worked with people going through all kinds of changes in their lives. And so the important aspect of being a healer is not just to treat people, but to help people become aware of the ways in which they're being asked to change. And if we don't heed that call, then we go into more severe healing crisis. And sometimes we don't make it out of those crises and we die or worse things happen. And so on a planetary level, we are in that deep 11th hour plus with climate crisis, so that we have been ignoring the call to change, ignoring the call to make changes that are sacrifices in a sense, and we ignore it. And there are all kinds of biases that we have that I discuss in the book for why we ignore the severity and the urgency of the climate crisis. So it is, I think, the final stage of this darkness that we've denied in ourselves. So that's why I often speak to the importance of abiding and staying close to difficulty, which is something that my favorite poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, always used to talk about and write about, of staying close to difficulty. Because if we don't stay close to our shadow and we don't work out our darkness inside, then we create darkness from the outside. And so viewing the climate crisis as an extension of our own darkness, because we have created climate crisis, right? So it's not separate from us. And again, we come back to this notion of separateness. So in viewing the outer world as separate from ourselves, we think this climate crisis is this thing we have to fight, right? And that's some of the reorientation and different new perspective I present in the opening chapters of how to see the climate crisis and our other crises for that matter, including our current political crisis, as an extension of ourselves, as an extension of our collective selves and our culture and the values that we hold. And so when we see it like that, we can view the climate crisis, we can view the political crisis as, yes, something that we need to control in a healthy way in the present to kind of stabilize the patient, and the patient being our culture and the world. It invokes a healing relationship when we see the outer world, and especially crises, as dynamics of our own collective inner lives.
Yeah. Every emotion that we have carries with it a certain vibrational frequency. And so we're exuding these frequencies. It's impacting the people and the woods and animals around us in such profound ways. And then we sit here and feel entitled to take and use the resources that are limited. And we don't, like you said, revere them anymore. We don't treat them as sacred. We treat them as we're entitled. I saw a meme one time, and it showed something I think really illustrates this. It was all the beings of the world, plant, animal, with a human right in the middle, like overseeing everything. And then next to it, it was another circle, but the human was in line with everybody else. It wasn't separate. It wasn't overseeing. It was a part of. And that idea of oneness, and the idea that we need to really take a look at the emotions that we're having and the beliefs that we have toward all of these things severely impact everything around us, including ourselves. So you talk about how certain emotions can help us. So how would people use their emotions? What tips do you have for listeners to deal with that and modify their emotional state?
Yeah. So before I get to that, what you were sharing before really touched me, and it brought up, I think, a really important point that I want to speak to, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You're mentioning the meme that you saw, the human centric, right, with everything around it, and then the human being part of everything, and that sense of oneness and how it's lacking. And so a big problem these days is I think a lot of people actually feel a sense of oneness and don't feel superior to the natural world and don't feel superior to their brothers and sisters. But the way that our culture is set up, especially the monetization of everything and how everything is for profit and how but just by making a living, to make a living, you have to destroy the planet. You have to participate in this death cycle, which is tragic. So this just invokes the nature of environmental activism and Extinction Rebellion, which is a nonviolent environmental action groups that's worldwide now. And I helped found a chapter of that here in Ojai, and it's really about lobbying our local governments to make change. And so I think that the more equality and the more fluidity that we can create and the more oneness that we can create between our governments and citizenry, the more we're going to have a sense of equality and social justice, which you and I have talked about, how social justice and environmental justice are so intertwined. And I present that and to segue into the question that you asked me about how we can, what I call, leverage our emotions, right, for good. And I think that the dynamic that I just described is of greed, right? And greed to me is a symptom. So a lot of people attribute the big problems that we have in the world and the destruction of the natural environment and political corruption and corporate corruption to greed. And in the book, I talk about, let's look deeper than greed. And greed is really a symptom of addiction. So, right, we become addicted to trying to fulfill an inner vacuity with things. And that just drives capitalism, it drives consumerism, it drives all the things that contribute to the destruction of the natural world and the deterioration of our own sense of integrity and sense of belonging. So how do we tackle greed, right, at its roots? And I propose that when we're rich inside and when we create rich inner lives, we don't need to create such rich outer lives, right? And when we have that sense of inner richness, we can do with a lot less. And that's part of the degrowth movement, which I really promote a lot in the book and I think
I
is
love
very
that.
valuable. And a lot of people don't like degrowth because their meaning and their sense of belonging and their sense of self-worth is based on how much they're earning or how much they've accumulated in their life. And so I like to revision that and say, well, how about we measure our sense of richness by our integrity? And integrity has to do with integration and how well we can integrate our mind and our body and our emotions. So, for example, the emotion of grief, right? So, whoever doesn't feel a certain amount of grief in the face of the world today is numb or asleep or living on a different planet. So, the emotion of grief, for example, I describe as teacher in the sense that grief teaches us to do without. Anyone who's gone through heartbreak and extreme loss knows that grief delivers you into a place where nothing really matters very much. Like nothing can replace that sense of loss or that sense of heartbreak. And you're just left with a broken, open heart. And for me, grief has trained and taught me, because I've been willing to learn, about how to do with less. So when I've gone through great stints of grief, things don't excite me anymore. It's not exciting to like go out to the mall. It's not exciting to have meaningless conversations at a party or to buy a new television or car or whatever. It's
Mm.
like I'm just in this place where wisdom says, be with your grief, be with your sadness, be in this time of fallowness, right? And that even fallowness is a metaphor for our time, right? So that we're not producing things 24/7, but we allow these times of transition. We allow these times of holy death to occur, such as through grief. And that's just one example. I could go on, but another one perhaps is fear, and I'll just touch on that briefly. Is a popular meme these days, especially in vis-a-vis COVID, the pandemic, is, oh, don't live in fear, right? And I say, no, that's a really superficial view of fear. And fear comes in so many different forms. There are many different kinds of fear. And we have to become emotionally intelligent to recognize what's healthy fear and what's unhealthy fear. What are the fears that we challenge and which are the fears that we abide? And learning the difference makes all the difference because it means life or death. So, for example, during the pandemic, people who say, oh, don't live in fear, just go live your life, don't live in fear. Well, that's dangerous.
Yes,
That's
it
that
is.
that that's mistaking a real holy fear, sacred fear, wise fear for um an irrational fear. So it's not an irrational fear to fear the virus. It's a healthy fear. I wrote a big article on that, and just for viewers, it's a really, really helpful article on fear. And it's the title, I wrote it on, published it on Medium, and the title is Pandemic of Fear. And it's about how to work with fear. But also in Climate Cure, I have a whole chapter devoted to fear. And I think it's, when I was writing the book, I didn't realize it so much, but I realize it now, especially having gone through and continuing to go through the pandemic, how crucial and how fundamental fear is and how important it is for us to really become emotionally intelligent with fear, because in a way, fear itself prevents us from leveraging the other emotions like grief, like anger, like despair, like hopelessness, because we're afraid to feel fear, we're afraid to feel anger, we're afraid to feel despair. But actually learning how to work with fear and those emotions in particular, we learn that they're not going to kill us, right?
Right.
And paradoxically, by disavowing them is what will kill us, because we grow that shadow when we disavow those emotions. We grow the shadow, which then has repercussions in the world, which come back to us in these comprehensive crises like the climate crisis.
Right. And I think a lot of the fear is driven by locus of control, worrying that you're going to lose control over your lifestyle, your freedom, your health in general. And so control has a lot to do with this. And if we can just help people understand, okay, certain things are in your control, certain things are out of your control. And you can take steps to manage what's going on. You don't have to control it necessarily, but if you take steps to manage it and be able to move through it and process it, that's a whole different experience. And that's a much
Diane,
lighter energy.
I love that you're saying that. And it's such a good point. And that notion of control, I think, works hand in hand with fear, right? So people either say, oh, feel no fear, or accuse others of being nothing but fear driven. And
Right.
it lacks nuance, right? And that polarization of all or nothing, that black or white thinking, is also a disease process in our culture. And so much is polarized. And when you look at how fear operates, fear is perhaps the most base emotion that we have. It's the most fundamental. And it creates the fight or flight reaction. And fight or flight, right? It creates a polarization. So when you're actually ruled by fear, you allow yourself to be divided immediately into fight or flight, into control or no control, and you lack the nuances. And so emotional intelligence and learning how to work with fear helps us do exactly what you say, where there's a balance, right? There's an integration of what we can control, what we can't control, what we can, what we should abide fearfully and what we shouldn't abide fearfully, what we should challenge and what we should respect, right?
Yeah. It
So,
also blocks our ability to trust that the divine has a bigger plan. If listeners believe in that, I mean, I do. If there's a plan and we don't get to know the whole plan, right? But so that requires a bit of trust. But then there are also steps that we can take. There's divine will and there's personal will.
mhm.
But if we're blocking everything else, that fear really you were talking about darkness earlier. I think it puts us in a place of darkness where we can't see clearly.
Right. I think that's just paying back to something that you said earlier in our conversation, but I can't quite invoke it right now. But I think it's that unconscious fear and unconscious emotion rules us and muddies our thinking. And yes, we're going to have bouts of anger and upset and outrage and tremendous fear. But emotional intelligence says, you know what, we can handle the upsurge of these emotions. And instead of acting on them right away, we allow them to flood us if they need to flood us, or right, but we breathe through it and we learn how to be plastic with these emotions so that we can leverage them, right? So that we can let go and minimize their extremes, because our brains, our nervous systems are really still caveman like. We're prehistoric beings trying to live in this modern world that we've created from our neocortexes. And a lot of our midbrain and our hindbrain are just still these involuntary reactions. And by using our neocortex, by using our awareness and our consciousness to moderate, right, and to create a little bit more plasticity and workability with these strong emotions that we come up, we learn that's an evolutionary integration process,
Right.
because our brains are really this very imperfect hodgepodge of evolution. We have these parts of our brains that don't really communicate that well with one another, but we can learn. Our brains are plastic, right? Neuroplasticity. So that,
Yeah.
and it's an exciting journey actually to integrate these aspects of ourselves.
Right. So you don't have to stay stuck in the same thought patterns, because if you focus on a new thought pattern, back to that neuroplasticity, it shifts the way that the neurons are firing. It shifts where all the connections are happening. And you can have a completely different belief system, but you have to be focused on changing that, creating a new habit, a new way of looking at things. Because I think a lot of what's going on in society is people are overwhelmed and people are anxious. They have a lot of anxiety, and that anxiety, back to fear, is stemmed from fear. It's about the unknown. Oh my God, what if this happens? What if it might not happen? But here's this anxiety that's overwhelming your body, and it's exacerbating stress and potentially illness for
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And so you talk about overcoming anxiety in the book. What tips do you have for listeners today?
Well, read the anxiety chapter in the book. That's the overarching tip. But I'm really glad that you brought up anxiety here towards the end of our conversation, because I think anxiety is probably the most prominent distressing emotion, right? And it's a form of fear. And
Yep.
the reason I have two different chapters, one for fear and one for anxiety, is because they're similar, but they're also very different. And the way you go about addressing and identifying fear is different than anxiety. So I think that without spending another hour getting into anxiety, we could do a whole show on
Yes,
anxiety.
we could.
But I think that for anxiety, I have a section at the anxiety chapter is one of the longest in the book, and I have 3 exercises and guides and tips that come to mind. There's one step, which is the 3-step anxiety management protocol or something. So it's 3 steps. And then I have another one, which is a 7-step process for dealing with anxiety in an embodied way, right? So it's much more visceral and somatic. So anxiety is both a somatic experience and a cognitive experience, right? So it's
Yes.
filled with distressing thoughts and also distressing physiology. So it requires really working with the physiology in an embodied way, and also learning how to regulate thoughts and learning how to cognitively work with distressing emotion, which touches upon something you were just sharing before about learning how to change our beliefs, right, and our perspective. And I speak a lot to that in the book. And what you just described is a top-down way, right? So it's working from the mind down into the body. And then there's another way of working from the bottom up, which is more of a depth psychological process where we actually embody and accept at face value the difficult emotions that we're having. And that's a bottom-up way, a depth transformational perspective and process. And then from the top down is equally important for how to not let those emotions overrun us and derail us, right? And also there's certain emotions which lend themselves to depth work, like grief especially. But then there are other emotions like anxiety that don't lend themselves that much to depth work. And we just need to sort of, tame down and then harvest the message in them. So one of the takeaways on anxiety is that there's part of anxiety which is just a pain in the ass and which is difficult and painful, and we should try to quell, we should bring down. And then there are other aspects of anxiety that we don't. Anxiety is not just stupid, right? It's something that carries a message for us. So what are we anxious about? So there's a process of, it's in one of the 3 or 7 step, I think it's the 3-step. Yeah, it's a 3-step process, is to identify what are we anxious about. We don't always know. And there are anxiety disorders sometimes that are just disorders. But in most cases, we're anxious about something. And so we can harvest wisdom from that. If we're afraid that an example I use in the book, if we're anxious that the sea is going to rise in our area where our neighborhood is over time due to climate change, then we can take steps to address that. And the wisdom and anxiety is, hey, take action, do something about it. Right. And but then if we're thinking about that all the time, and we're thinking about it before we go to sleep, and we're waking up thinking about it, and we're obsessing about it, then you can work top down by learning how to use mind control. Actually, it's just as simple as that. It's like you just stop it, and you can distract yourself, you can get yourself into other things, you can exercise. So there's a whole somatic cognitive interface integration with how to work with anxiety. And so the last thing I'll say about this is, at the end of the anxiety chapter are 22 anxiety tips. And they're really, really practical, helpful tips for how to deal with anxiety.
Awesome. So tell listeners how they can get a hold of you, what other books or articles they can look at any events that you're having.
Okay. I think, without giving too much information, I think that one of the best resources is at my website, at my blog site, at my website. And I publish usually 1 or 2 blogs a week on current events, but integrating a lot of these different topics. So the blog section at my website, which is Jack Adam Weber with 1 B in Weber.com, jackadamweber.com. And then there's a Facebook group that I created, which is the Climate Cure Discussion and Support Group. And that's an excellent group where I also blog. I'll make usually, 1 blog post there a week. And I sort of, it's usually a couple paragraphs or a few paragraphs, synthesizing some of the information from Climate Cure in a novel way that's a bite-sized piece that, and then we have a discussion about it there. And I think that's a really great resource. And those are 2 really easy to access, digestible ways to access my work. And then, of course, the book is the best that I have. I gave it all I have. I spent 6 years writing it. And if you want a deep dive into not just the climate crisis, but crisis generally, and how to become more whole and to become part of the world and find your purpose and your meaning, and to learn how to overcome and also work through and to leverage difficulty, especially difficult emotions, for the greatest good. That's what the book is about. And it culminates in freeing ourselves up inside and just invoking that line that I read at the beginning, how I propose that 75% of what prevents us from becoming engaged and effective and to live a rewarding life happens between our hearts and our first steps in the world. So it's an inner job. And that's the deep dive I take in Climate Cure.
Awesome. So the book is Climate Cure, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. On the Llewellyn website, it's also there. And I
Yeah,
highly recommend it. I think you'll benefit greatly from reading this book. And I am so happy that you were here today. Maybe we will do a show going another time on just anxiety. It is prevalent out there.
yeah, yeah,
So thank you
yeah.
so much for being on, and thanks to our listeners.
Thanks, Diane. It's wonderful to speak with you.